Night shift. True scary stories. Our scary and horror stories are designed to send chills down your spine. Enjoy the spine-tingling stories thrill. Story number 1. The Haunted Hospital Shift. Sarah, a nurse working the night shift at an old, abandoned hospital, often heard strange noises and felt a chilling presence. One night, as she was checking empty patient rooms, she heard a child's laughter echoing through the hallways. The problem? There were no children in the hospital, and it had been abandoned for years. Terrified, she quickly finished her rounds and left, never to return to that job. Story number 2. The Mysterious Warehouse. Mark, a security guard at a remote warehouse, experienced eerie occurrences during his night shifts. He repeatedly spotted shadowy figures on the security cameras, but when he investigated, no one was there. One night, he heard whispers and footsteps coming from the dark corners of the warehouse. He resigned after he found a photo of himself sleeping at his post, even though he had been alone on the shift. Story number 3. The Midnight Library. Emily worked as a librarian in a historic library with a reputation for being haunted. One night, while organizing books, she heard the sound of pages turning in an empty aisle. When she approached, she found a book floating in the air, seemingly turning its pages on its own. She ran out of the library and refused to work alone at night again. Story number 4. The Phantom Warehouse Worker. Alex worked in a massive warehouse that stored various goods. One night, he saw a figure wearing a uniform identical to his own, pushing a cart down an aisle. Thinking it was a coworker, he approached to chat but found no one there. The figure vanished into thin air, leaving Alex terrified. He later discovered that a former employee had died in a similar accident years ago while working the night shift. Story number 5. The Cursed Factory. Carla worked in an old factory that had a history of accidents. One night, she heard faint cries for help echoing through the darkened halls. She followed the sound and found a dusty, forgotten room with an old, rusted machine. In a pile of debris, she uncovered a decades-old newspaper with a headline about a tragic factory accident that had occurred in that very room. She quit her job the next day. Story number 6. The Eerie Asylum Security. Michael worked as a security guard at an abandoned asylum. One night, he saw strange lights flickering in the upper floors and heard faint whispers. When he investigated, he was met with a gust of cold wind, even though the windows were sealed shut. As he continued his rounds, he felt a hand on his shoulder, but when he turned around, no one was there. He quit his job immediately, convinced the asylum was haunted. Story number 7. The Abandoned Hotel. James worked as a night clerk in an old, deserted hotel that had been closed for renovations. One night, he received a call from a room that wasn't supposed to be occupied. When he arrived at the room, the phone was off the hook, and the room was ice cold despite having no electricity. He quickly hung up the phone and left the hotel, only to discover that the phone line to that room had been disconnected for years. Story number 8. The Haunted Restaurant. Lisa was a waitress at a restaurant that was rumored to be haunted. During late-night closing shifts, she often heard dishes clinking and the sound of footsteps in the kitchen, even though she was the only one there. One night, as she was stacking plates, she felt a cold hand on her shoulder. She turned around, but no one was there. Terrified, she quit her job shortly after. Story number 9. The Creepy Morgue Attendant. Mike worked as a morgue attendant, responsible for preparing bodies for autopsies. One night, he was alone in the morgue when he heard a low, raspy voice whisper his name. He turned around to see a body on the examination table, its lips moving as if trying to speak. Shocked, he ran out of the room and never returned to the night shift at the morgue. Story number 10. The Phantom Janitor. Karen was a janitor in an old office building with a reputation for being haunted. One night, as she was cleaning the empty offices, she heard the distinct sound of a mop bucket being rolled down the hallway behind her. When she turned to investigate, there was no one there, but the mop bucket continued to move on its own. She dropped her cleaning supplies and fled the building, never returning to her night shift. Story number 11. The Ghostly Elevator Ride. Tom, a security guard in a high-rise building, often had to ride the elevator to check various floors. One night, as he rode the elevator to the top floor, it suddenly stopped between floors, the lights flickered, and the temperature dropped dramatically. Tom felt an icy hand on his shoulder, and when the elevator finally resumed, he was on a different floor. He quit his job the next day. Story number 12. The terrifying warehouse entity. Rachel worked in a large warehouse with a history of strange occurrences. During one night shift, she witnessed a shadowy figure slowly creeping along the aisles, seemingly composed of darkness itself. It had glowing red eyes that fixated on her as it moved closer. Frozen in fear, Rachel finally managed to flee the warehouse, leaving her belongings behind. She refused to work another night shift there. Story number 13. The Cursed Factory Night Watchman. John was a night watchman at an old factory. One night, he heard eerie whispers and footsteps in the empty factory halls. As he approached a dimly lit corner, he saw shadowy figures moving about. Suddenly, a deafening scream echoed through the building. Terrified, John fled and later learned that the factory had a history of tragic accidents and mysterious deaths. Story number 14. The Phantom Call Center. Amanda worked in a 24-hour call center, taking late-night calls. One night, she received a call from an unidentified number. A chilling voice on the other end whispered her name and said disturbing things about her personal life. When she traced the call, it led to an empty, abandoned building. The calls persisted, and Amanda eventually left her job, haunted by the unknown caller. Story number 15. The Haunted Hotel Room. David was a night manager at a historic hotel. One night, a guest in room 333 called the front desk in a panic, claiming to have seen a ghostly apparition in the bathroom mirror. David went to investigate and found no one in the room. However, as he looked into the mirror, he saw a pale, ghostly face staring back at him. He left the room in a hurry and later learned that room 333 was infamous for ghostly sightings. Story number 16. The Phantom Patient. Rachel worked as a nurse in a small, rural hospital. One night, she received a call to check on a patient in room 203. However, room 203 had been vacant for months due to renovations. As she entered the room, she saw an elderly woman in a hospital gown sitting on the edge of the bed. The woman asked for her son and then suddenly disappeared. Rachel was so shaken that she requested a transfer to the day shift. Story number 17. The Ghostly Security Footage. Mark worked as a security guard at an office building with a history of paranormal activity. One night, he was reviewing security camera footage and saw a transparent figure floating through the corridors. The figure seemed to glide effortlessly through walls. Mark rushed to the location but found nothing unusual. The incident left him terrified, and he never watched security footage alone again. Story number 18. The Phantom Playground. Sarah, a night custodian at an elementary school, often had to pass by the playground on her rounds. One night, she saw swings swaying and heard the faint laughter of children. Thinking it was vandals, she approached the playground, but there was no one there. The swings continued to sway on their own, and the laughter grew louder. Sarah quickly retreated, convinced that the school was haunted by ghostly children. Story number 19. The Ominous Night Auditor. David worked as a night auditor at a remote hotel. One night, a guest approached him with a complaint about loud footsteps coming from the room above. David knew there were no guests on the floor above, as it was under renovation. As he investigated, he too heard the heavy, rhythmic footsteps above, but no one was there. The eerie sounds persisted for hours, and David quit his job the next day. Story number 20. The Mysterious Midnight Library Patron. Emily, a librarian, encountered a peculiar patron during a late-night shift. A man dressed in old-fashioned clothing entered the library and asked for obscure books that hadn't been checked out in years. As she retrieved the books, the man vanished into thin air, leaving behind an icy breeze. Emily later learned that the library had a history of ghostly encounters with a former librarian who had died decades ago. Story number 21. The Haunted Hospital Nursery. Lisa worked as a nurse in a maternity ward at a hospital known for its paranormal activity. One night, as she was checking on the newborns in the nursery, she saw a woman in a white gown standing by one of the cribs. Assuming it was a fellow nurse, she approached to ask a question, but the woman suddenly vanished. Lisa later learned that the hospital had a history of mothers who died during childbirth, and some believed their spirits lingered in the maternity ward. Story number 22. The Possessed Night Security Guard. Michael was a night security guard at a historical museum. One night, while patrolling the exhibits, he felt an overwhelming sense of dread. As he passed by an ancient artifact, he heard a malevolent whisper in an unknown language. Suddenly, his body seemed to move on its own, attempting to interact with the artifact. Terrified, he quit his job and sought help from a paranormal investigator. Story number 23. The Sinister Hotel Room. Sarah, a hotel manager, received complaints about room 666, where guests reported eerie encounters. One night, she decided to spend the night there to investigate. As she lay in bed, the room grew icy cold, and shadowy figures moved around her. She felt an oppressive presence and saw handprints on the fogged-up mirror. Sarah checked out of the room in the middle of the night, convinced that it was haunted. Story number 24. The Phantom Factory Worker. Tim worked at a manufacturing plant with a history of accidents. During a late-night shift, he saw a fellow worker in the dimly lit factory, operating a machine. When he approached, the worker turned to him with a blank, expressionless face and continued working. Tim called out, but there was no response. Suddenly, the figure disappeared, and the machine powered down on its own. He quit his job soon after. Story number 25. The Ghostly Night Pharmacist. Sarah worked as a pharmacist in a 24-hour pharmacy. One night, she was alone behind the counter when she heard the sound of pill bottles rattling and footsteps approaching. She turned to find a shadowy figure in a tattered hospital gown. The figure reached for a prescription, and its hand passed right through the counter. Sarah fled the pharmacy and refused to work night shifts again. Story number 26. The Malevolent Hotel Elevator. Jason, a hotel bellhop, had a chilling encounter with an elevator during his night shift. As he rode the elevator to a guest's floor, the lights flickered, and the doors opened to reveal a pitch-black hallway. Feeling an ominous presence, he tried to close the elevator doors, but they wouldn't respond. He heard a sinister whisper in his ear before the elevator finally returned to the lobby. Jason quit his job soon after. Story number 27. The Phantom School Custodian. Tom worked as a custodian in an old school building. During a particularly quiet night, he heard the faint sound of a broom sweeping the hallway. Thinking it was a colleague, he followed the sound, but no one was there. As he continued his rounds, he noticed that classroom doors were creaking open and shut on their own. Tom left the school that night and never returned to his night shift. Story number 28. The Cursed Nightclub. Sarah was a bartender at a nightclub that had been the site of a tragic fire decades ago. During late-night shifts, she would often hear mournful cries and smell burning wood, even though there was no source of the scent. On several occasions, glasses and bottles would inexplicably shatter, sending patrons and staff running in fear. Sarah eventually quit her job, unable to bear the haunting experiences. Story number 29. The Ghostly Air Traffic Controller. Mike worked as an air traffic controller in a remote tower. One night, he received a radio transmission from an unidentified aircraft requesting clearance to land. The voice on the other end sounded distorted and eerie. Mike granted clearance, but the aircraft never appeared on the radar and never landed. The voice on the radio continued to speak cryptic phrases, leaving Mike shaken and doubting his own sanity. Story number 30. The Ghostly Computer Lab. Mark, a computer technician, worked in a university's empty computer lab late at night. One evening, he noticed that one of the computers had mysteriously turned on. He approached it to investigate when the keyboard keys started typing on their own. The screen displayed a series of strange symbols and messages about an ancient curse. Mark hastily shut down the computer and left the lab, unnerved by the inexplicable event. The end.